At first glance, this game seemed like an awesome premise for a story set in a completely unique universe, and paired with some really enjoyable and well-made combat, all of which resulted in a game that right away you could tell was going to be very, very solid. But the further you get into the story of Clair Obscur Expedition 33, the more you realize that that wasn't the case at all. This wasn't just your stock standard fantasy game with some lovable characters and a unique sense of style. It was a thought-provoking masterpiece that completely subverted everyone's expectations, essentially becoming a different game as you enter the final act, somehow becoming even better than it had been up until that point. It's been exactly 1 year since this game launched in April of 2025, winning just about everything it could have in the award season and becoming one of the most successful and awarded games in history, which is insane to think about when you consider the fact that this is the first game from the team at Sandfall Interactive, a team made up of ragtag developers cherry-picked from different studios, some of which were incredibly experienced in the industry, while others on the team had literally been working in other fields prior to this game. This was the type of game that when you finish, you kind of just sit there staring at the screen for what feels like an eternity after the credits roll. And to me, these are the type of games that I will always want to discuss in depth, which is exactly what we're going to be doing today, because 1 year on, I still think this is one of the most beautifully crafted pieces of media the world has ever seen. Now, I think where I need to start for this game in terms of what I think is done so phenomenally well is generally just the art direction, the aesthetic, and overall design of the game. This is what I think is the most defining trait of Expedition 33, regardless of how good the story, the combat, the characters, and all of those elements are. This is kind of the thing that I always think back to when I think about this game. From the very initial trailers, we could see that the style behind this game was absolutely insane looking, with the sort of Belle Epoque oil painting style to it. And although we will get to the actual story behind that later on, initially it just seemed like a really cool way to design a game. It's something that I haven't really seen before, and from the very first trailer, it absolutely hooked me in just how this game looked. The art direction for this game is so intentional and so clear in what it wants to be, with even the title of the game referencing art itself. For those who didn't know, Clair Obscur is obviously a French term, and it's used in art to describe a strong contrast of light and dark, which is obviously something we see countless times throughout this game, both literally and figuratively too. It feels like there is so much intention to every element in this game, whether that be the gameplay, the story, the world, or any of the different mechanics throughout the game, but the art style is sort of the glue that holds all of those things together, in my opinion, and it's a huge part of why this game felt so unique compared to so many games out there that I've played, because I really never have played a game that looks and feels quite like this. Now, a huge part of that is obviously the look, like I said, the actual aesthetic and the art direction, but a huge part of it too is also the soundtrack, and I think it kind of goes without saying that the soundtrack for this game is phenomenal. In my opinion, it is one of the best soundtracks of all time, with almost every single song that is played throughout this game being so memorable to the point that you can actually remember the parts of the game that those came from. Now, the story behind finding the artist behind this soundtrack is actually insane. I would recommend checking out SkillUp's video on this, because he did a great interview with a bunch of people on the dev team, and some of the stories in that video are just absolutely mental, so be sure to go and check that out. But the general gist of it is that one of the lead developers just happened to be scouring the internet late at night on some absolutely obscure website, an hour after the musician posted some of his music on that site. By complete random chance, this developer came across the artist, reached out to him, and they began to work together. And this was the first game that he ever scored, and yet it turned out to be, again, in my opinion, one of the best soundtracks that we have literally ever heard. Something I loved about this game is that each area of the map and each area of the story had its own little section of the soundtrack too, with so many memorable tunes in each location that as soon as you kind of hear that music, it just takes you immediately back to that part of the map. Like I said, there are countless songs that as soon as you hear that, you just know exactly where you were and who you were fighting in that part of the game. Now, a huge part of the art direction as well in any game is to do with the cinematography, and I think for me, this adds so much to any game that I play. There are countless games out there that they can have a really decent story, good acting and all of that, but if the cutscenes and if the quality of those cutscenes are not up to scratch, it just feels so much less immersive. One game that I always point to with this is Horizon Zero Dawn, or realistically both of the Horizon games, where there really aren't that many high quality cutscenes. A lot of the cutscenes in that game are just the typical old school RPG dialogue where it's just the camera pointing at Aloy and she's just saying her lines, and then it cuts to the next person and they say their lines. And don't get me wrong, that's fine. I'm actually a big fan of the typical like old school RPG format, but I think when you don't have any high quality and immersive cutscenes to go along with that, it takes away from the immersion so damn much. But that was definitely not a problem in this game, because some of the cinematography at points throughout the story was absolutely phenomenal, and to me that adds so much to the quality and that sort of AAA feeling, even though, like I said, this is from a dev team who are pretty inexperienced at the end of the day. To go along with the cinematography, some of the animation when it comes to the actual gameplay and the combat is just phenomenal. Some of those animations in certain attacks just blew me away every single time I did those attacks, and it made the combat just beautiful to watch, honestly. Both the enemies and our squad moved so fluidly and in such great combinations, especially with great sound design, that it just made that combat all the more fluid and all the more exciting. Now, I obviously touched on the aesthetic for the game, and a big part of this too is the actual map design in terms of how the map looks and feels. And while some maps out there are fairly similar throughout the majority of the map, this is not one of those maps. Each area in this map was just completely unique from the last one. And one thing that I noticed as well, pointing back to that sort of art direction, is that they used color so well to convey feelings and meanings throughout the game. This game gets so much darker as it goes, not only in terms of the actual storyline and the plot points, but literally the color of the game gets darker as it goes. We start off in Spring Meadows, Flying Waters, and the Ancient Sanctuary, all of which were really bright, colorful, and just very great to look at. But as the game progresses, it gets darker and grittier, with places like the Stonewave Cliffs, the Forgotten Battlefield, and Old Lumiere. Regardless of those color palettes, it looked amazing throughout the entire game, and I really think that each of the different regions were just so memorable for their own reasons, but a huge part of that was the look and the feel in combination with, like I said, that unique soundtrack for each area as well. Now, this brings us to another part of the game that I think is honestly one of the most crucial elements in any game, at least games like this, and that is the world design of Expedition 33. Now, not only am I talking about the actual physical map design and level design, but also just the world itself, the premise of the game, the whole idea of Lumiere and the Paintress, and sort of that core idea of this world. Like I mentioned earlier, this gripped so many people immediately, not only from our first time playing, but even in the first trailers that we ever got for this game. It was such a unique setting and premise that drew people in immediately. Now, at least how we see this game initially is that the game is set in a sort of haunting, dreamlike world where the fate of Lumiere and its people is controlled by a mysterious entity known as the Paintress. Now, obviously, every single year, she paints a new number on the monolith, counting down year by year, and everyone of that age instantly dies in what's known as the Gommage. In order to fight back and try and save lives, groups of expeditioners head out to try and kill the Paintress to put an end to the unnecessary death, though none have ever succeeded in their task, and it feels like an impossible mission filled with danger and death. Now, that alone is such an amazing premise for the game that obviously, like I said, hooked millions of us from the very first story trailer as an awesome setting for a game. But towards the end, we learned there is actually quite a lot more to it than that, which I'll touch on properly once we get to the story section of this video. But it's fair to say, regardless of the twists and turns at the end, the initial setting for the game itself is absolutely phenomenal. One thing I absolutely loved about the world design in this game was some of the environmental storytelling. There were so many extra bits of lore to find throughout the world that weren't really requirements to the story, but they added so much depth overall. And I think that's the type of thing that I love to see in games, where those who don't really care as much and they just want to breeze through the story, you can do that without being flooded with a bunch of exposition. Whereas for those of us who actually want to learn more about the characters, the setting, the story, and all that stuff, there is stuff out there to find that fills in those gaps and fleshes out the story that bit further. One thing I loved were all of the expeditioners' notes that you could find with information on previous expeditions and how far they'd made it. We're obviously dropped into the world of Expedition 33, but there were 67 expeditions before that, and to me that was something I was really interested to learn more about, because that is a hell hell of a lot of expeditions that are going out there and trying to end this endless cycle of death. Something else I loved as well was that a lot of the story was told through optional dialogue at the camp, which was easily missable, but it added so much depth to the story and to the characters for those who wanted it. Now, with all of that being said, the actual level design itself, in terms of the map that we are playing on, the different areas we can go to, I thought this was equally well done and made for gameplay that to me personally never really felt boring. There was never a part of this game where I was kind of plodding along, just trying to get to the next area. It felt like there was always something to find, always a bunch of hidden little secrets, and also plenty of combat to be engaged in, as well as, like I said, plenty of different unique areas to actually go through so that the map didn't feel stale and like we were just in the same place the entire time. Now, the larger world map, otherwise known as the continent, was a really unique way of actually creating this map. Obviously, in the early stages, we are running around in that typical third-person style, and that is how I'm usually used to playing these sorts of games, having not really played many older JRPGs where that seemingly originated from in terms of the inspiration. But I thought this was a really cool way of doing it and actually expanded the world a little bit more. It made it feel a bit more of an open world game in some ways, like you could kind of go anywhere and do anything in the order that you wanted to, even though the actual story itself was fairly linear. It was definitely a very unique approach that initially, I won't lie, I did find this to be a little bit odd. The first time I was thrown into this sort of top-down view, I was kind of like, what the hell is going on? Is this just like a mini game or something like that? I definitely found it quite strange, but once I got used to it, I kind of look back at that now as being such a huge part of the charm of this game. That's one of those things that a lot of games out there wouldn't try. They would just stick with the typical third-person look, but the team at Sandfall was so willing to take risks and do a bunch of unique stuff in this game that I think ultimately all paid off. Now, through the continent, you could not only go from point A to point B in terms of getting to the next part of the story, but there were also plenty of hidden items or little mini games to play. One of the fan favorites was the kind of only up section of the game, where out of absolutely nowhere and for pretty much no reason, you could just play only up within Expedition 33. And although it was not nearly as hard as the actual game of Only Up, it was honestly pretty thrilling. And even though I got there in my first attempt, I was honestly shitting bricks the entire time because it really did feel like you were about to fall all the way down and lose all of that progress. Another one of these that I got stuck on for so long, not really stuck on, but my stubbornness just got in the way, and I was playing this for a good like half an hour for literally no reason, was the race area of the map, where there was kind of this obstacle course and you had to race along and try and beat the time that it's set. And I kept just falling short, only by the tiniest little margin, and that led to me just playing this over and over and over again until I finally beat that time. Those little things throughout a game like this, they are insignificant at the end of the day. They're not important to the game. They don't necessarily make it that much better. But those things to me do matter because it kind of shows the love that was poured into this game by the developers. They didn't need to put those sort of mini games in here. And with such a small development team and with how good the rest of the game is, it's just another one of those things that's kind of absurd how they could manage to do that to such a high quality as just a completely optional, hidden little random part of the map. And yet playing them was honestly some of my most memorable parts of the game overall. Now, ultimately, I think the best part about the level design was kind of going back to the art direction, just the beauty of each of these different areas. I touched on it earlier, but each different area in this game was just so beautifully crafted and never really felt like they cut corners or slacked in that area of the game. Early on in the game, we're kind of blown away with the whole underwater area, which just defies physics and it doesn't really make sense, but it didn't break immersion. I never went, what the hell, am I actually underwater right now? What's going on? You just kind of go with it and it just makes sense in that moment. But then the next area that we go to is just a completely red color palette, and it is pretty much the complete opposite of that underwater section. And that to me just adds so much to the game when each of those sections are so memorable. It's so easy to kind of differentiate those parts of the game and it doesn't blur the entire journey into one. You kind of remember each chapter as they went, and at least to me anyway, that just makes the game so much more memorable. Now, at the end of the day, the map design doesn't really matter if the combat and the general gameplay of a game isn't good, because it doesn't matter how good it is to explore. If getting into combat isn't enjoyable, then most people are going to fall off of that game and they're not going to enjoy it. They're not going to see it through to the end. And luckily for us, that was not the case with Expedition 33. This was some of the most enjoyable combat that I think I've ever played. And this is coming from someone who is not a turn-based type of guy. This is not my go-to, but I'm going to be honest, this game kind of made me fall in love with it to the point where I would love to play more games like this, and that's something that I wouldn't have thought heading into my first playthrough. The combat was just so exciting, so enthralling, and so engaging the entire way through this game. I thought it was phenomenally well designed, and although turn-based combat is not something new, I do think that they evolved on that initial style, adding things like parries and dodges, which in my opinion were a game changer that I really think go fairly underrated. I think if you took this game's combat and actually removed the parries and the dodges, it may have felt completely different, and it may have never been as engaging and exciting as what we actually got in the finished product, which, don't get me wrong, for fans of turn-based combat probably wouldn't have made that much of a difference, but I do think for the more casual and wider audience, and I'd even include myself in that, regardless of being someone who's like an avid gamer, the game would have felt completely different without those, I guess, more mainstream mechanics in there. Due to the parries and the dodges, this game almost became a rhythm game at times with those systems in there. Something that I learned pretty early on in this game is that sound played a huge part in timing your dodges or your parries, more so than the actual visuals. A lot of the time you wouldn't even bother really looking at what the enemy's about to do. All you needed to do was just listen to the sounds that would indicate they're about to attack, and that is when you would time your dodges or your parries. And I think for me, once I figured that out, it made the combat so much easier, because I will be honest, early on I was just getting clapped because I was focusing too much on the visuals of the enemies, and just like the old classic FromSoft games, for example, or really any Souls-like out there, a lot of these bosses, a lot of the harder enemies, they'll do those staggered attacks where it looks like they're about to hit and then they just kind of slowly keep that movement going and then they hit you, and it just always throws me off personally. Doesn't matter how many Souls-like games I play, I always struggle with that, but with the audio cues in the background, it made it so much damn easier, and also honestly just made it more satisfying. Some of the sound design in this game was absolutely phenomenal, and actually hitting a parry just felt so satisfying because of the audio cues that go along with it. Now, the combat itself was obviously very fun and very well designed, but something that really evolved that system even further to me was the Pictos and Luminous systems that were in this game that really allowed you to kind of customize how you wanted to play. Now, a sort of brief explanation of this system is that Pictos were essentially perks. You were able to choose 3 throughout the game, some of which you would unlock as you go, and they give your character an ability or a bonus of some sort. That in itself is obviously pretty standard, but the Luminous system is where this kind of went to a different level. After X amount of successful battles with that Picto equipped, you would then unlock it permanently to be able to use across any character in a completely different slot than those Pictos, and so you could now kind of start stacking these together once you'd unlocked a bunch of Lumina, and that's where the true depth of this combat actually came out to play. On top of that too, there were underlying stats that actually went with them, which I'm not going to lie, the first time I played this game, I did not see that for a good 5 or 6 hours, and eventually that also changes how you think about it, because sometimes I was picking the Lumina based on the actual stats and not so much the ability or the bonus that it gave me, and sometimes there were just insane builds that you could make where you could just tank out a character and kind of give them some pretty bad Lumina, but Lumina that would have crazy health stats, for example, and you could just turn that character into an absolute tank that would eat damage for days. And honestly, it was so much fun to kind of min-max all of your characters like that and give everyone a completely different playstyle. Not only did this result in really fun individual sort of character building, but you could build some really cool squads as well between all of your different characters. One example that I've got was I, for a long time in this game, was running the squad of Luna, CL, and Mayel, and I'd built these characters out to be completely dominant in combination with each other. As an example, Mayel had an attack for me where if you used it on a burning target, it would like double the damage and you would get your AP back. And with Luna and the team, I would instantly start with a magic attack that would burn the enemy. It would then switch to Mayel, and I would pretty much just delete that enemy in one hit. It would then go to CL, and her combination with those 2 characters would pretty much buff both of the other characters, so then it was instantly a 2v3, for example. And I've also completely buffed my team. They have their attacks, it barely does anything to me, and from that point, I'm pretty much guaranteed to win that fight. I was using that squad for a very long time, to be honest, and it was completely overpowered, but one thing that I loved about this game was that even though I found that squad that I think for a while there I thought I would just stick with it, once I changed things up, I actually found other squads that were just as dominant, and towards the end of the game, I was just swapping out characters before every single battle because all of them were so enjoyable, and they all bounced off each other so damn well. Now, when it came to fighting regular enemies, it didn't really matter too much what your squad was because the combat was fairly easy against just like regular goon enemies. But when it came to the boss fights, this is where building your squad and your individual characters was very, very important. The boss fights throughout this game all felt really different from each other, and I honestly enjoyed every single boss fight that was in this game. Obviously, some were better than others, but there are so many memorable boss fights throughout this game that challenge you in a bunch of different ways. Now, some of the memorable ones early on were the likes of Vivek and Goblu, who were two of the easiest ones that sort of introduced you to boss fights in general. But as you get further through the game, they did certainly get a lot harder. There was the likes of the Lampmaster, for example, which was not only a little bit harder, but it was the first boss that felt like it was straight out of a horror. To be completely honest, this was like a Souls-like design, which honestly I love. There was then Duelist, who was also in the same boat too. Some just really cool and more dark designs that, like I said earlier, as the game went on, the game got darker in general, and the bosses sort of matched that. Now, as you made your way through the game, there came a very important section where you got pretty close to the monolith, and it felt like you were not far away from actually challenging the Patris. But this is where countless boss fights actually made their way in, and this was a pretty relentless part of the map. There were two different key bosses that you needed to beat before you could make it to the monolith. At least we thought they were two bosses, but there were more than that in these areas. On the first one, there was a section with 3 different bosses, all of which were essentially a different mask. There was the Jovial Mask, the Seething Mask, and the Sorrowful Mask, and you had to beat each of these individually. You also then had to sort of do a riddle to actually get to the final boss without increasing their power, because if you answered those riddles wrong, the final boss in this section actually became stronger, and that is something you definitely didn't want to happen. This section ended with the Visages fight, but then you learned that that wasn't really the case, because there was then another boss fight after that, which was with the Mask Keeper. This whole section of the game felt absolutely brutal, but in a good way. You could tell that the story was starting to heat up, and this kind of felt like trial by fire, just constantly having boss fights after the boss fight, like it was preparing you for the end game. Serene was then the other boss that was blocking the way to the monolith, and this was a really cool section of the map, arguably one of the most memorable to me. Not only looking unique, but there were also a lot of flying enemies that really did force you to change things up to your normal playstyle. You had to shoot these enemies if you wanted to hit them, otherwise they had a huge chance of dodging your attacks. But then by shooting them instead of using your abilities, you were dealing a lot less damage and you were kind of burning through your AP. And like I said, this just kind of got you out of your comfort zone and forced you to play a little bit differently to how you'd been playing previously. At the end of that section though, Serene herself was very, very tough and definitely one of the biggest set pieces of the game too. This boss fight is so memorable to me. It's one that I did struggle on a little bit, but it was so enjoyable to beat her at the end. And it made you kind of wonder, okay, if this isn't the final boss, what is that final boss fight going to end up looking like? Because this thing was one of the biggest set piece bosses that I've played in a very long time. Now, after that section of the game, you do finally make it to the monolith. And obviously after going through plenty of combat to get to the end of this section, this is where we reach not only the Patris, but also Renoir. It goes without saying that these were also some of the best boss fights in the game and definitely some of the biggest spectacles too. When it comes to the Patris, this was one that we were building towards the entire game, and we knew that this would more than likely be the final boss. At least we thought so anyway. And regardless, this was an awesome boss fight that was definitely one of the biggest spectacles and set pieces in the game, and it really did feel like it was about to all end right there. While the Patris was really only one boss fight, Renoir was a recurring enemy throughout the game. There are actually 3 different boss fights with him, all completely unique, all exciting, and all with evolutions from the last one in terms of his movesets, which really kept you on your toes. You couldn't just learn his attacks in the first boss fight and know how to beat him and then just copy paste that into the next boss fight. He did change things up, and it kind of made me feel uncomfortable the whole time. I knew that there was extra attacks coming in the second and third boss fights, which made these boss fights all the more difficult. Now, the first one at the Manor, this was very difficult, and this was kind of the first real test in the game for me. This was the first one that I really struggled on and probably got stuck on it for, I don't know, 5 or 6 different attempts until I finally took him down. The second fight with Renoir was right before the Patris, and this one was very exciting. He added like an electric lion to his arsenal and made it all the more difficult. While the last one was Renoir, but it was actually him posing as the curator, which again, we will touch on later. But this one was definitely one of the more stunning fights in the game, with some huge set pieces happening behind the fight itself, adding even further to that spectacle. Overall, the boss fights in this game and just the combat in general were some of the most enjoyable and memorable parts, as they should be, and it really added to the intensity in those moments compared to the regular combat encounters. Now, so far we've gone through stuff like the art direction, the world, and the combat, and obviously those are all very important parts of any video game out there, but when it comes to a game like this, let's be honest, the story is the key part of this game. It is the thing that takes a game like this from a really good game to, in my opinion, a masterpiece. And there is a hell of a lot to go through in this section of the video. Now, I don't want to spend too much time talking about the initial parts of the story. Like I said, the initial premise of the story is amazing in itself. The whole painter's situation in Lumiere, that idea of a countdown where everyone of that age dies every year and expeditioners are setting out to stop this from happening. That in itself would have made for a phenomenal storyline despite what happens in Act 3. If the story actually ended there, I still think this would have been a game that I would look at as probably not quite a masterpiece, but something that would be probably like a 9 out of 10 for me. I still loved the game up until that point, based on that initial premise that we know of anyway. From the very beginning of the game, we were immediately thrown into a sad situation as Gustav, seemingly the main character of the game, at least at that point anyway, has to say goodbye to his love interest, Sophie, who is erased by the gommage. And that is literally what gommage means. For those who don't know what the term gommage means, it literally means to erase or to rub out. Now, due to that part of the game, right off the bat, we know this story is going to be deep. We do not start a game like that and then just peter out to a boring ending. And so it really set the tone from pretty much the first 10 to 20 minutes of the story that this was going to be an absolute roller coaster. Now, we set off on the expedition, and after such a heavy start, at least for me, I assumed this would be a pretty chill introduction to the world. We would get out there, we'd have some tutorial sections and stuff like that, and it would be a bit more of a relaxing start to the game. That is not even remotely what happens. Literally about 80% of the expeditioners die immediately to a strange man that we come to learn is Renoir. And so within probably 30 to 40 minutes of the game starting, we've seen two pretty like cataclysmic events happen. And like I said, this is a hell of a way to start the story. The initial gommage moment to me was like heavy enough that I was kind of like, all right, let's just chill out a bit and get into the world. And then as soon as I think we're doing that, just immediately we're hit with 80% of the characters dying right off the bat. Like I said, this really set the tone for the rest of the game. And in my head, this set the precedent that at any point, these characters could die. This was kind of that moment where I went, all right, no one is safe in this story. It's like that Ned Stark moment from Game of Thrones. Spoilers for anyone who hasn't seen that yet, although what are you doing if you haven't? But when he dies in season 1, it's kind of like, oh shit, literally anyone is going to die in this show. And to me, that's a really important thing to set early on because it adds so much further to the stakes. Now, because of that early precedent being set when they actually land on the continent, that caused it to not be a big shock to me, actually, that Gustav died at the end of Act 1 in what I do think caught most people off guard. But for me, I actually wasn't really that shocked about that moment. Like I said, I was kind of expecting someone to die from that main cast. And although Gustav was sold as kind of the main character leading into this game, obviously Charlie Cox was playing him. He seemingly was the main character. After a few hours of playing this game, it did feel pretty early on that focus had shifted to Mayel, at least for me anyway, and that Gustav was more of a vessel for the story to move forward, a key piece of the puzzle, but not someone who was absolutely necessary to keep around. Now, while the death itself didn't sadden me all that much, if I'm honest, what did get me emotional was the funeral scene not long after this. This part of the game, in my opinion, was done so well, and it kind of made the death sink in a little bit more to me, with this being a slower, more intimate moment for the group, and that was the first time that I genuinely felt sad about Gustav dying. It's not like I didn't like his character or anything, but I never attached to him the same way that I did to Mayel. So when he died initially, I was kind of like, damn, that sucks, but I don't really care too much. Yet this funeral completely changed my perspective on that. Now, not long after Gustav's death, we were introduced to Verso, who kind of takes his place within the group realistically, but I don't think we had really learned of his importance just yet in that moment. Rather, it was revealed to us throughout the rest of the game. Now, again, for me, I feel like it was somewhat obvious that Verso was going to be Renoir's son. The hair, the matching scars on their faces, and the fact that they had both survived the gommage and were kind of just floating around in Lumiere after all this time, that was something that I guessed early on. Not to say I'm some sort of prophet who can just tell exactly what's going to happen, but to me, that was one of the more obvious things. And so as soon as I saw saw Verso, I was kind of like, all right, I know something's sus about this guy, but we needed to get through the story to actually learn the importance of Verso to the story overall. But honestly, this whole section of the game is not what I want to spend most of my time talking about when it comes to the story. While it was amazing, like I said, it felt like it was on track to just be a really decent story and a cool setting as the team fight their way through the continent, eventually making their way to the monolith, where we face off against the Paintress in what I assumed at the time was the final boss fight, and essentially the final moments of the game. We'd been building up to this boss fight the entire time, and as we finally beat the Paintress, it did feel as though the game was coming to an end. The team have destroyed the Paintress and they return to Lumiere to celebrate with its citizens that the endless cycle of death is finally over after 67 years of expeditions. But a character called Alicia tells Verso via a letter that the Paintress has actually been painting on the monolith as a warning, and that Renoir is actually the one doing the killing.
Perhaps you differ from your father and your sister, as I differ from mine. Your mother paints life, whilst your father, death.
Now at this moment, when it feels like the game is about to have a happy ending, the monolith explodes and we see literally everyone die to the gomage in a completely mind-bending scene that, I will be completely honest, I had like put my controller down at this point. I was taking some notes and just soaking in this final bit of the game, at least I thought it was the final bit, and when this happened, my jaw hit the floor. I genuinely just sat there watching this like, what the fuck is going on right now? And I have to assume most of you felt the same way. From here we see the revelation that this entire story to this point had been taking place within a canvas from the Desandres family. We see a flashback where the family was devastated by a fire, losing Verso, who saved the life of his sister Alicia, and through some brief cutscenes we learned that the whole game until this point had taken place in Verso's canvas, his last painting before he died, where Aline, otherwise known as the Paintress and Verso's mother, as well as Verso's sister Alicia, have essentially been living in order to keep their memories of Verso alive. Now this means that the Verso and Renoir that we had seen to this point in the game were actually not real, and nor was Maëlle. They are all painted versions of themselves, painted by Aline, otherwise known as the Paintress, because she is stuck in this canvas. She is mourning the loss of her son, and she's doing everything to stay in there and pretty much keep the memory of Verso alive by any means necessary. Now, because of that, that means that the Renoir we've seen throughout the game to this point was actually painted by Aline to be her protector. That is not the real Renoir. That is essentially a figment of Aline's imagination, and she also painted Verso to keep his memory alive and to essentially numb the pain that he was gone in the real world. We learned that Maëlle went in to actually destroy the canvas, but she was overtaken by Aline's chroma. So rather than going in as a paintress herself, she was reborn into that world as a painting from Aline, and she was born again as Maëlle. What this means though is that when she gommages at the end, when they've made it back to Lumiere, is she doesn't actually gommage because she is a painter. She can't be erased from the canvas. What actually happens and why she has white hair when she returns is that she has recovered her memory. The Maëlle that we play as the entire game is essentially a painting of Maëlle because, like I said, Aline's chroma overtook her and she was reborn. And that version of Maëlle has no knowledge of any of this. She is just a citizen within Lumiere. But when Renoir tries to gommage everyone, he just erases the chroma that she was originally overtaken by. And so now she is no longer a painted version of Maëlle. She is actually a paintress herself. Hence why she's able to bring people back and is aware of the situation going on around her. Now, circling back to Renoir, there's a reason that he looks so different at the end versus the one that we see throughout. And that is because that was Aline's painting of him, like I mentioned earlier. The Renoir we've seen is not actually Renoir, whereas Renoir himself was actually posing as the curator the entire time, helping the expedition, because at the end of the day, he wants the canvas destroyed. Ultimately, Renoir is such a grey character in this whole story. He's portrayed as both the villain and kind of as the hero at the same time. On one hand, he is the bad guy. He's trying to rid everyone and technically kill all of them, but it's not for a bad reason. He's trying to remove his family from the canvas to get them back to reality, to the real world, because that's where they belong. He knows that Aline and Alicia staying in the canvas is only causing their suffering to last even longer over the loss of Verso. This is where the story became so much more interesting to me, because the question I have is Renoir actually in the wrong here? On one hand, he was posing as the curator who, throughout our entire playtime till that point, had been a good character. He had been helping us along the way, and I would have considered the curator to be a hero of the story. On the flip side, this guy is literally trying to Thanos snap every single person out of existence in this painting, and so it becomes such a grey area where you can't really tell whether he is in the right or the wrong, and it really gets you thinking. Now, as far as they know, the people within this canvas are real, living people. They are not aware that they're inside of a painting. They are living their real lives with real memories, real relationships, and real futures that they want to live. And so, do they deserve to die just for the Desandres family to go back to their real life? On the other hand, it is all fake, isn't it? This is all a make-believe world. None of this is real. And so I can see Renoir's point of view where he doesn't care about those paintings and the characters we've come to love throughout the story, because realistically, they're not real people. But again, that gets you thinking, is Lumiere just as real as the real world? Luna, Ciel, for example, all of those characters, they have real lives and real memories within the canvas. And so even though we know that it literally is a fake make-believe world, how is that actually any less real than the real world? All of those characters have real lives, they have relationships, they have memories, and so how is that any different than the real world? And it really puts you in this position where I don't know what stance to take. I don't know if Renoir is doing the right thing or the wrong thing. And I'll be honest, still, after months of working on this video, I actually still don't know where I stand on that whole topic. Now, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with Renoir, we are faced with the final boss fight of this game, which is Renoir, but he is posing as the curator. And eventually, once we finish this boss fight, the story then begins to circle back to Verso. He finds himself in a sort of rift between the canvas and the real world, where he sees a young version of himself painting. Although it's never really confirmed, I like to think that this white boy is that tiny piece of his soul that's left in the canvas that is mentioned when this whole revelation happens. Verso talks to the boy, asking him if he's tired of painting.
You're tired of painting, aren't you? I'm tired too.
After that dialogue, you can see that he then begins to see where Renoir was coming from, realizing that he's just a figment of imagination, and that at the end of the day, he's causing both his sister and his mother to become lost in the canvas, trying to keep his memory alive. This results in a final confrontation between Maël and Verso. He believes that it's best for his family to leave the canvas and move on with their lives, whereas Maël, on the other hand, explains why the canvas is so important to her.
This is not worth your life.
What life? My life of loneliness in a shell of a body, with no voice and no future.
You're Maël. No matter where you are, you don't need this canvas.
But everything I want is here. Here I have a chance to live, Verso, to live. Up there I merely exist.
She makes it clear that she hates her new life after the death of Verso, having become scarred by the fire, a shell of her former self, and living a life without her brother. But in the canvas, she feels as though she has a fresh start, a new lease on life that is better than her actual reality. At the end of this conversation, the two characters realize that the only way to determine the outcome of this is to fight and pretty much determine the fate of the canvas. Now, at this point, we're put in a pretty precarious situation because we have to choose between two different endings here and pick and choose between two characters that this far into the story I'm sure most people cared about a lot, and both of these endings are very interesting to say the least. Now, if you choose the Maël ending, she obviously wins the fight and she does resume control of the canvas. Verso knows that she's going to bring him back and pretend like everything is fine, losing herself in the canvas and pretty much subjecting him to this fabricated life, a life that he tells her he doesn't want. From here, we fast forward to Lumiere, where there's a show about to begin at the Opera House, and inside, Esquier and Monoko and the rest of the gang are there, sitting in their seats, waiting for the show to begin. We see Maël holding the hand of a young boy. Now, we don't know for sure who that is, but my assumption is that it's just a young version of Verso, or potentially the white boy now painted into this reality, both of which are, I guess, technically the same thing. But I am keen to hear your thoughts on that as well, because we never really have had confirmation about who that boy is. Now, in this moment, we also see the return of Gustav and Sophie, and I can't lie, this moment in the game, this had me in tears. It's not like I was fully bawling my eyes out, but I was definitely shedding a tear at this point of the story. The thing with Gustav is that I never saw him as the main character or my favorite character at all. Like I mentioned earlier, I actually never really felt that attached to him. But to me, I did feel emotional at his funeral and at this moment because of what he meant to Maëlle, the character that I cared most about. And so weirdly, I kind of cared for Gustav through Maëlle, if that makes any sense. Now the show begins and we see an old Verso take to the piano, but immediately it goes from being a pretty happy scene to a scene that is pretty obvious to tell something is wrong here. Verso resents this. He's essentially a puppet for Maëlle to pretend like everything is fine, but he himself knows the reality and knows that none of this is real. He is just a puppet in her grand play to pretend like this is her real life, and it's clear to see he is not happy about that by the look on his face. As he begins to play, it cuts back and forth between the two characters, and we're actually hit with almost a jump scare moment of Maëlle, her eyes the same as Aline and Renoir when they were stuck in the canvas, and from here, the credits roll. This pretty much confirms the fact that Maëlle truly does become lost in the canvas, living a fake life, a life of make-believe, just to avoid her actual reality without Verso. Now, going back to the fight between Maëlle and Verso, if you actually choose Verso's side in this battle, he obviously wins that fight, sending Maëlle back to reality. Once she's gone, we also see him say goodbye to Esquier and Monoko, which was also pretty hard to watch. We learn throughout the story that these are his own creations within the canvas based on his stuffed toy and his dog before he died. We see Ciel say goodbye, understanding his decision, although clearly not being that happy about it, while Luna is not happy at all with this decision, still angry that he knew about all of this all along, and she fades away without giving Verso or the group a proper goodbye. Verso and his younger self walk off together, fading away, and confirming the destruction of the canvas and Lumiere as we know it. From here, we're then taken back to reality where the Desandres family gather at Verso's grave to finally mourn him together as a family, signifying that they are trying their best to move on. Maëlle is forced to say goodbye to everyone from the canvas one last time, and the credits roll on this version of the ending. Now, the real question you're posed with at the end of the game, especially if you've done both of these endings, is which ending is actually the right one? Either way, you're kind of denying one of the characters from the ending that they want. If you choose Maëlle, Verso is forced to live a fake life as her puppet. Choose Verso, and Maëlle is forced to live in a reality without the life she preferred within the canvas, as well as finally having to say goodbye to her brother. Now, for me, the logical and reasonable choice here is Verso's ending. Hardship and struggle are a part of life. We all have to go through them, and it's about how you decide to move on and make life better from that point forward. Sending Maëlle, or Alicia, back to reality was obviously hard on her in that moment, but I'd like to think that in time, she moves on and lives a happy life, although we never really know what happens at the end. Based on that, I do think that the Verso ending is the logically good ending, I guess. And yet, regardless of all that, it's not the ending I prefer. In a weird, probably fucked up way, I kind of prefer Maëlle's ending. She was the character that I was drawn to and cared about the most throughout the game, and so even though it was fake, I kind of liked seeing her have the happy ending where she got to live her life in the canvas with the rest of the characters that we'd grown to love throughout the game. My thinking is that eventually she would have come out of the canvas anyway. Her body is still in reality, and Renoir, Aline, or her sister Claire would have come back to extract her at some point, because it's not like she was just in there for eternity and her physical body would die, but maybe that is just some absolute copium from me. In reality, I don't think there is a good ending. I think the point of these endings is to leave us conflicted regardless of our choice, and to leave us deep in thought about this game, its themes and its intentions for a long time after we played it, which I can safely say for myself has been the case. I've still been thinking about this game pretty much every single day since I finished it, and I'm sure that will carry on a long way into the future. I think about this game all the time and and think about the themes it was trying to convey about mortality, living with grief, and the choices we have along the way to either wallow in our pity and live in the past, or whether we face the hardship now in order to feel better in the future. It's one of the deepest, most intricate stories I think I've ever experienced, not only in a game, but just in any form of media. And without question, it has become one of my favorite games of all time, deserving of all its praise and all of the awards it racked up. Though I will say, I stand by this. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 should have won RPG of the Year at the Game Awards. That was an absolute robbery. But outside of that, I think it deserved every other award it won. The story is supported by some incredibly enjoyable combats, a cast of brilliant characters and their actors, and arguably one of the better soundtracks ever made. And I truly do believe that all of that results in one of the best video games that has ever been made to date. There is so much to discuss with a game like this, and so I am very keen to hear all of your thoughts down in the comments section. What are some of your favorite moments from this game? And I'm also very keen to hear what ending you guys actually preferred, but not only the one that you preferred, the one that you thought was actually the right decision at the end of the day. If you've made it all the way to the end of the video, I very much appreciate you guys sticking around for my very long ramble about a game that I truly love. There is plenty more content like this on the way, so if you guys do enjoy this type of content, be sure to hit that subscribe button. There is a lot more stuff on the way, not only similar to these sort of retrospective type of content, but I do also want to pivot to just some more like off-the-cuff opinionated content on news that comes out within the industry and, you know, relevant games that have just come out and stuff like that. So keep your eyes peeled for all of that. Like I said, leave your comments down below. I'm keen to read through all of that and continue discussing Expedition 33 with you guys. But with that being said, thank you all very much for watching. You guys have a great day, and I'll catch you all in the next one.